Good afternoon and welcome. It's a great pleasure to welcome John Alterman, whom I've known off and on for about more than 20 years. And it's always good to see him. We see each other in Washington every so often, in fact, but far too infrequently. He holds the Zbigniew-Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy and is Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And before joining CSIS, he served as a member of the policy planning staff at the Department of State and a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. And he worked on the Baker-Hamilton Commission, which produced this famous report on Iraq. In addition to his policy work, he teaches Middle Eastern Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and at George Washington University, so he does turn an honest penny from time to time.
Is teaching honest?
Yes.
Oh, I thought it was a leisure activity.
Well, before entering government, he was a scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace and at the Washington Institute for Near Eastern Policy. And he was from 1993 to 1997. He taught at Harvard, where he received his doctorate in history. And I remember very well his comprehensive exams, which I did the sort of Middle Eastern history bit of, which he sort of just swam through.
I still don't know how tobacco was sold in France in the 1780s now. That was one of my problems. I still don't know. Anyway,
Well,
okay, pass it.
Here he is. So today he's going to talk to us about the so-called pivot to Asia, in from the other side, how America's growing ties with Asia will sustain America's ties with the Middle East.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back at the Middle East Institute. I think I was here when the Middle East Institute was sort of a glimmer in people's eyes. My previous trip to Singapore, people said, I think we're going to sort of formalize our Middle East Institute. We're going to bring people together. And it is wonderful to see that you have a building, you have my dear friend Peter, and you have people coming from around the world to be here. And it's wonderful to see that it's growing that way. It's great to be back in Singapore. As I have gotten more interested in this whole Asia-Middle East piece, I think it is increasingly apparent that people think about the Singapore experience. People thought about Singapore and Dubai and what it means. People thought about the models here for what it means for governance in the Middle East. So it's especially interesting to talk to people in Singapore about what they make in the Middle East. And one of the things that strikes me is just how much people in Singapore need you guys. There is not the depth of knowledge, there's not the experience that other places in the world have. I think as Asia looks and sees that we'll have an increasing tie to the Middle East, there is an increasing understanding that Singapore and other Asian states need people like you to help them understand what's happening over there. So I'm delighted to be here. It's of course a great delight to see Peter again. We both used to be younger, and he hasn't changed in that much. So. For all this talk of the pivot to Asia, and I know people in Asia talk a lot about the pivot to Asia, to my mind, the pivot to Asia is most keenly felt in the Middle East. That for all that people in Asia think the pivot to Asia is felt in Asia, the people in the Middle East feel the pivot to Asia is felt even more starkly there. It comes, I think, from this deep sense of insecurity about where the U.S. is and where the U.S. will be, which dates back in this administration to the president's first inaugural address in 2009, where he said, every day brings further evidence that the ways we use energy strengthen our adversaries and threaten our planet. Now that was a great applause line in Washington, D.C. But if you're sitting in Riyadh or Kuwait City or any of the other places in the Middle East which have relied on the United States to provide security and provided the backbone of how these countries think about their place in the world. That's an incredibly threatening construct. Again, each day brings further evidence that the ways we use energy strengthen our adversaries and threaten our planet. Who are the adversaries, by the way? Given the fact that every time Parade magazine in the United States, that free insert that shows up in the Sunday newspaper, publishes their list of the 10 biggest dictators in the world, the king of Saudi Arabia is always on the list. I mean, who's the enemy? And this is the question that began the way people in the Gulf looked toward the United States and the U.S. commitment to securing the future of the Middle East. There's also a sense that the U.S. has shown absolutely no resolve in Iran, that the U.S. has been naive about Iran, the U.S. has been deeply naive about Egypt. If you rely on the United States to provide security, to provide a basis for the security of the region, there's a sense this administration is simply out to lunch. After a sense of optimism in the early days that Obama was going to be a different kind of president, right? And then there's a sense that Obama would be friendlier to the Middle East after the Bush administration as opposed to war in Islam. There has been this deep sense of disappointment. I think there also is a sense in which President Obama became disappointed with the Middle East. I would argue, misplayed the Arab-Israeli conflict by laying down an early marker on settlement construction with Israel, which turned into a standoff that he didn't win. He got fed up with Iraq. He just lost patience. I think he has been disappointed with Iran, that he extended an open hand. He got nothing from Ahmadinejad. I think this is part of a growing sense in the administration that the president's legacy isn't going to be made on foreign policy. And this is a president, you remember, John McCain ran an attack ad saying that Barack Obama is an international celebrity. And he was greeted at the Brandenburg Gate by European crowds. And there's really a sense that this was going to be a cosmopolitan international president. I think the president's decided what really matters, what's really going to make a difference, is not the stuff overseas, it's the stuff at home. And on a strategic level, I think there has been an instinct in the administration to disengage a little bit from the Middle East because it presents a set of problems that ultimately can't be resolved by the United States. The U.S. has left Iraq undone because there's no way for the U.S. to fix Iraq, to leave it done. Afghanistan, supposedly the good war turned out not to be such a good war. And we just saw today the president told Hamid Karzai, I'm planning to leave, totally leave. And if your successor wants to make a different deal, we'll change. But the current plan is we are 100% out because of the sense we can't make it. There's a growing sense that in a world of increasing American constraints, the U.S. can absorb, the Middle East can absorb all of the U.S. energy, all the U.S. money, all the U.S. military manpower, and the problem still lies. So why should the U.S. continue to invest there? In addition, I think there is a sense among many people that this growing energy independence, at least on a North American scale, frees up the United States to look at global security in a different way. And there's a sense that the U.S. doesn't have to invest quite as much in protecting these global supply chains. In reality, the U.S. relationship with the Middle East has never been exclusively about a U.S. relationship with the Middle East. The U.S. relationship with the Middle East has been about protecting the Middle East's role in the global system. It's about protecting the global economy from external shock. Asia's ties with the Middle East are growing rapidly, extremely rapidly. If you look at where the future energy consumption will be in the world, it's almost exclusively in Southeast Asia. And so as U.S. ties with Asia grow, and I think that's undeniable, I would argue that while the administration may have an instinct to not be as exposed in the Middle East, the U.S. is getting drawn into the Middle East from the other side. that you can't be serious about security in Asia without being serious about security in the Middle East, because Asia's security is dependent on security in the Middle East. The question, I think, is what are the implications of the US seeing the Middle East increasingly from Asian eyes rather than European eyes? What are the implications of seeing the Middle East more in terms of energy security and a more mercantile sense than a sort of rules-based approach, a post-colonial approach, an intervening and putting your thumb on the scale to get just outcomes approach that's characterized the US approach to the Middle East for much of the 20th century. And I think that ultimately what role the US plays in the Middle East in this new environment is going to tell you a lot about what role the US plays in the Middle East. Because the US role in the Middle East will not be a direct role, it will be part of how the US sees its global role. I think for all this talk that the Asia pivot is the US turning away from the Middle East, I think in reality it's the US turning away from Europe. And I say this as somebody who's not a Europeanist, so I have no stake in that story. It is turning toward Asia, there's no question about that. And it's finding a new normal in the Middle East that's not based on actively fighting two wars in the region. Don't forget that while Afghanistan wasn't in the Middle East, the Afghanistan war was fought out of the Middle East. And the question becomes, what is a normal US military presence in the Gulf? What are the threats in the Gulf? What are the threats to navigation? What are the national threats? There's a reluctance to think through those questions very much, because there's a sense among Gulf governments that more is more. Right? That more troops, more material, more equipment, that provides more security. It's a sign of resolve. It keeps the Iranians on their toes, that more is more. But what are you really defending against, and how much does it take to do that? What makes this, I think, all the more complicated is this idea that the US is thinking about what its role needs to be in the Middle East according to its traditional way of seeing things. There's also the question of what the US role should be in the Middle East if you start seeing things from an Asian perspective. If you start thinking more about the need to protect the sea lanes across the Indian Ocean, what do you need in the Middle East to protect those sea lanes? If you become more focused on the Strait of Hormuz and the Straits of Malacca and less focused on Suez? I mean, how do you conceptually think about that? I think people are reluctant to think too hard about it, but it's a hard question. We are used to, just from a military perspective, we're used to thinking about the fact that you can get ships from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea through Suez. So the 5th and 6th Fleet of the United States becomes sort of fungible. Well, if you lose Egypt, where you don't have the guaranteed ability to quickly move things through Egypt, that becomes less of the case. And I think we are still trying to figure out what the future of our relationship with Egypt would be and how much we can rely on using the Mediterranean as a way to provide greater security for this Indian Ocean component of the Middle East security nexus. As you know, the Middle Eastern trade increasingly flows east to Asia, and not west toward Europe. That's certainly true in the world. 80% of the oil comes east. The Asian countries, I think all the Asian countries, have growing interest in the Middle East, but they don't have much influence. Energy dependence on the Middle East started with Japan in the 1950s, when Japan switched to an oil-driven economy, and Japanese industrialization was driven by oil, and Japanese imports of oil shot up. Korea now imports more from the GCC than China does. And everybody pays attention to the Chinese role in the Middle East, because the Chinese rate of import is increasing rapidly. And there's a sense that China is the future of the market. But in absolute terms, South Korea has a huge trade with the Middle East. Japan has a huge trade with the Middle East. China has a huge trade with the Middle East. As the Indian economy opened up in 1991, they developed a huge trade with the Middle East. All these countries, and it's all of their economic development industrialization, in addition to their transportation, is tied to Middle Eastern oil. Despite deepening economic involvement with the Middle East, Asian states have been wary of too much diplomatic involvement with the Middle East. China, as it often does, has spoken out for a negotiated settlement of everything. China doesn't want to be involved, just include us in the negotiations. You have a quartet, how about making a quintet? We can play a game of that. The Chinese want to be involved in negotiations, but the Chinese really don't have very much expertise in the Middle East and are afraid of alienating anybody in the region. South Korea looks at the North Korea-Syria relationship and wants to support international efforts in Syria, but they don't want to get directly involved. I think Japan also fears, how do we keep a strong relationship with the United States? We have a commercial interest in having a relationship with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. There's this sense that the Asian countries have, they don't want to pick sides in a region which increasingly seems to be determined to push people to pick sides. I think there is not only a recognition of US capability in the region, but throughout Asia, there's an acceptance of US capability in the region. I said, the US can go alienate people. I had this great conversation with a Chinese diplomat in Algiers. And the Chinese embassy in Algiers, by the way, is in de Gaulle's old mansion. That's the way the Algerian revolutionaries got stuck it to the French. That, okay, communist China can have their embassy in de Gaulle's old mansion. And it was the first sarcastic Chinese diplomat I ever met. And at one point in our conversation, he said, I have an idea. How about you do security, we do business? And that's I think, the sense of all countries in Asia, and certainly China, is why should we go alienate people? Why should we pick sides? Why should we get involved in these things? We should just talk about how we're ready to resolve and let the United States absorb all the anger, all the frustration, everything else. For the foreseeable future, Asian energy security is going to rely on US energy security, which is the US will provide, the US military will provide security for Asian oil for the foreseeable future. Despite this, I think, inevitability of the US playing a security role in protecting the flow of oil out of the region, as part of its global role, there's still this Middle Eastern sense that the United States isn't really there, the United States can't be relied upon. There's a sense not only of US disinterest, the sense of US abandonment. I think this comes in two principal places. First, in the wealthy GCC states, a sense that the Americans are just looking to make a deal with the Iranians anyway. Aren't the Iranians more attractive? Don't the Americans really want to have a deal with the Iranians? Don't the Americans really like the Iranians more? There's always this sense, whenever you talk to people on the Arab side of the Gulf, there is this constant fear that the Americans are looking to jump and switch sides and abandon the Gulf Arab states to the tender mercies of the Iranians. I think there's also this deep frustration in Egypt that the US was supposedly promoting the Ikhwan at the expense of US allies. There's a sense in the Gulf the US was totally naive about what was going on in Egypt. And it is sometimes blend together in a sense that the US is both naive and ineffectual in a region that preys on people who are either naive or ineffectual. The US happens to be both in their eyes. I think what the US sees itself doing, and the US military sees itself doing, is we're somehow trying to right-size the American war. That we're not fighting two wars anymore. That we have global responsibilities, and what are the real threats in the region? And it's hard, if you're a US military planner, to say, well, we have to commit scarce resources merely for reassurance. There's no actual war-fighting need, there's no actual security need, it's just to make people feel good. The US doesn't put troops places to make people feel good. It puts troops places to do stuff. And so what needs to be done in the Gulf? There is a way in which our troop presence to fight wars in Iraq and Afghanistan created a new normal, and an uncertainty for how we ever get away from that without sending this message of abandonment to the Gulf states. I think there is keen interest in the Gulf about rising US energy independence, and there's concern about it. It's not a coincidence that Saudi's national oil company, Aramco, has a half share in Motiva, which has the largest refinery in North America, whose operations can refine more than 1 million barrels of oil a day, and that they are tuned, the Motiva refinery is tuned to refine Saudi crude, heavy Saudi crude. It doesn't work for what you get out of the Bakken shale field. It's in the wrong place. It does the wrong kind of work. the Saudis have invested lots of money in making sure the U.S. is an enduring customer for Saudi oil, and that's a strategic Saudi investment, the same way the Saudis are investing in building refineries in China to become enduring customers for Saudi oil. There's also, of course, the Saudis buying $60 billion of U.S. weapons, which I would argue is a Saudi effort to rent U.S. attention. Because when you sell a weapons system, you not only have a commercial interest in sustaining the link, but there's refurbishing, there's training, there's upkeep, there's a whole series of things that come with a weapons package. And the Saudis and the Emiratis and others feel the way to get sustained ties with the United States, a sustained strategic relationship, is to create a commercial imperative and an ongoing sustainment imperative that keeps Americans caring about what happens. What the Emiratis are doing in particular, I think, unique to the GCC states, is they're trying to develop a whole array of customers who care a lot about what happens in the UAE. So they're buying Russian weapons and French weapons and British weapons, and there's an encampment of South Korean special forces. They are trying to make the world care about the future of the UAE as a way of keeping everybody involved in their prosperity. And that's partly driven by a sense that the U.S. needs to be the cornerstone of UAE security, but they can't rely only on the United States. I think you also see Kuwaiti efforts to expand facilities for U.S. troops. They built Camp Arifjan to replace Camp Doha. It's free. They supply free food, fuel, and things like that. Qatar has used Al Udeid Air Base as a way to keep the Americans caring about Qatar. Bahrain hosts the Fifth Fleet, and whenever I talk to people in the U.S. Navy, they say losing Manama as a port is unsustainable for the United States. And that makes it strategically important for the Bahrainis. And it's all part of an understanding in the Gulf that no country or collection of countries can do what the U.S. government can do, even on a scale down level. That the U.S. just has a capability of order of magnitude higher than anybody else's. And for the United States, I think, quite frankly, it's difficult to even contemplate abandoning the global role. It's too built into the DNA of how Americans see the universe. But even so, it's not hard to grasp this administration's attitude toward the Middle East. There's a time of fatigue. I think people have decided that the U.S. has made unwise investments in the Middle East for many years. Iraq is largely forgotten in the United States. Libya is even more forgotten than Iraq is. Syria seems insoluble, and while people in the expert community, my friends, all think the U.S. should play a more active role in Syria, there's not support in the public. And whenever I talk to people in the White House, they'll point to the fact the public simply doesn't support this. I think also many Americans have written off the Arab-Israeli conflict as insoluble, and they wouldn't support a large diplomatic effort, which arguably explains why the president has not publicly identified himself with resolving this conflict. There's also not just this sort of diplomatic fatigue in the United States, but there's also a time for constrained military budgets. The U.S. is looking to cut obligations and not build them, especially trying to avoid these expensive deterrence operations. We used to have 2 carriers off the coast of Iran. We used to have 4, we now have 3 carriers that are at sea at any given time. And to put 2 of them off the coast of Iran is simply not sustainable. You can't do it. The previous commander of the U.S. Central Command, General Mattis, was extremely reluctant to devote any U.S. troops to Syria because they might need them for an Iraq contingency. So just everything is spread too thin. And also comes a time, as I said, with this notion of energy independence, where people think we just don't have to care. So the public's view is, why do we care about oil-rich places in the world? We have enough oil. The Obama administration came in 2009, and their whole energy strategy in the campaign in 2008 was about carbon and limiting carbon, and suddenly the whole energy policy is about how do we get more energy out of the shale fields and unconventional oil and gas. There is a sense, I think, that a lot of Americans have that it's time that we end this codependence we have with the Middle East, that it's a relief to end the codependence we have with the Middle East. I think it's popular in the United States to talk about turning our back on the region. In all of this, Iran is sort of an interesting viewpoint because Americans are still emotional about Iran. It's partly because of the hostage crisis in 1979. It's partly because of the nuclear issue, which is an issue that still resonates with Americans. It's partly about Israel. I think there is interest but skepticism in the public about President Rouhani. Yet, if we make a deal with President Rouhani, in many ways it makes our problems with the Gulf states worse. Partly because they think we'd be naive to take a deal, the Iranians won't abide by the deal, and partly because they think it would free Iran to become a regional hegemon. In my judgment, the game the Iranians are playing is not necessarily to resolve their problems with the United States, but to break apart the international coalition that's been isolating Iran. And I think in many ways they would take either outcome. Either they can resolve their issues with the United States and the international isolation diminishes, or the United States isolates itself by pressing too hard, loses the Chinese, loses the Indians, loses even some European countries, and that's fine. And that helps the Iranian energy industry come back and frees Iran from the cost of all these sanctions. What all this amounts to, I think, is you have a lot of signals pointing to the United States wanting to limit its exposure to the Middle East, but a lot of reasons why the U.S. can't really limit its exposure to the Middle East. Partly because nobody can do what the United States does and can't do. Partly because nobody wants to take the U.S. place. Nobody wants to begin to take the U.S. place. To a country, they try to supplement the U.S. role rather than supplant the U.S. role. No country is seeking to be U.S. rival. And instead, what they want to do is they want to criticize the American approach without really putting forward something else. I think the Russian role is especially interesting, right? Because the Russians have been in a rivalry with the United States in the Middle East, and they're playing a very different role. They seem to want to push the U.S. to devote more resources to the region rather than less, arrest this rebalancing away from the Middle East, and have the U.S. be tied down in the Middle East, while the Russians then play small games to advance their goals and create more markets for their weapon systems. My understanding, it may or may not be true, is that the Egyptian-Russian arms deal is financed by the UAE as a way of sending a message to the United States. But if you're a Russian arms merchant, a $2 billion arms deal is welcome in a shrinking global arms market. To my mind, the Russian position on Iran is similar to its position on Syria, that it's avowedly working to solve the problem, but it's actually in close dialogue with the target state, and it's not all reliably supportive of international action. What I think the problem from a U.S. perspective is, as we think about this global role, which is retrenching, is the U.S. isn't used to thinking about global stuff. We're used to thinking about bilateral things. We're used to thinking about regional things. In the Cold War, we were focused against the Soviet Union. And that was essentially a bilateral relationship that we were focused on. We think about the Middle East. We think about the U.S. Central Command. We think about the Near East Group, the State Department. We think about East Asia. We think about China. We think about the Pacific Command. The U.S. is not used to thinking about how things connect. The U.S. Central Command was involved fighting 2 wars. The Pacific Command was dealing with the rise of China. Well, what does the rise of China have to do with Middle Eastern oil? That's too hard. It's different people, it's different institutions, different bureaucracies. We don't think in those ways. We have too many specialists and not enough generalists. So much of the U.S. government ends up being task-driven. And what are the tasks that have to do with connecting these ties? What are the tasks that have to do with perceiving the U.S. role in the world? the sense of U.S. resolve. Whose responsibility? Who's the undersecretary for U.S. resolve? We don't have one. We're not good at that. We're too big. We're too specialized to take that task on. Our military forces in China Asia are focused on China. Our military forces in the Middle East have their own set of distractions. You're starting to see this changing. The U.S. security economic dialogue with China mentioned the Middle East. But I would argue it didn't seriously mention the Middle East. It involved restating our talking points because of a fear that if we said something that wasn't in our previous talking points, the Chinese would notice we were departing from our talking points, and that would represent its own diplomatic agenda that they didn't want to engage with. The problem also is that there aren't really a lot of Asian counterparts we can talk seriously with about the Middle East. I mean, there's not a Middle East expert community in Asia that can engage in a global way. I think Asia is still trying to understand the Middle East is still trying to understand Asia. The problem isn't only that the East doesn't reach West enough and the West doesn't reach East enough. I think it's going to take some time to create a community that can do that. What I think is most striking about the U.S. approach to the Middle East for the last 60 years has been this persistent effort to create a durable system of alliances, of trade and defensive pacts that create a regional environment that protects the interests of the United States and its allies. Despite the fact that the default construct in diplomacy is bilateral relationships, but the U.S. has consistently invested in these international institutions. There aren't really international institutions to deal with this East-West trade. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization doesn't really have much traction to it, doesn't have much weight. I think the question, and it's a real question, is will the United States, as it moves forward, step away from this multilateral approach that's taken to global security? Will it step away from having international institutions protect this East-West trade, protect the Indian Ocean trade? Because we know that most countries in East Asia aren't really interested in contributing. China doesn't support international institutions at all. It won't contribute to it. It thinks that spending money on global public goods is foolish. China's interested in China's narrow national interests. India's interested in India's national interests. What would happen in this environment if the U.S. were to decide it was going to play the same game? And it wouldn't contribute to these global public goods. It wouldn't invest as much in protecting the sea lanes that go across the Indian Ocean. It would invest in protecting narrow things. I think there's a sense that the Middle Eastern states would rather the U.S. focus on bilateral ties. This Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC +2 construct they came up with several years ago, which is GCC, Jordan, and Egypt. It was always the GCC -5. It was always these countries wanted specific relationships with the United States. Would that really be in their interest if the U.S. were to emphasize a bilateral approach? I think probably not. We're not there. We can point to some multilateral efforts. You have the Combined Air Operations Center in Doha. You have the decision I think recently made in December that the U.S. would treat the Gulf Cooperation Council as a single customer for some military deals. I don't even know what that means, but I'm told it's meaningful. But it seems to me that for a lot of the people who are calling most for U.S. leadership are also the same people who object to the kinds of institution building that have formed the core of the U.S. approach to the Middle East, specifically global security more generally in the post-war world. The question I think that all of this raises is how we pass the multilateral moment in the Middle East. And that has a huge implication for the way Asia relates to the region, the way the U.S. relates to ties between Asia and the Middle East. I think the ideal is a different model, a multilateral framework that enjoys greater support for its beneficiaries, combined recognition among states that as states, they share an interest in supporting open trade and investment and cooperating against transnational criminal networks of all stripes. The problem is how do you convince governments to invest in this, to cooperate in this? And I think governments appear increasingly reluctant to do so. Taken broadly, there's no question that Asia's ties with the Middle East are going to grow, and the Middle East ties with Asia are going to grow for several decades in the future, and I think there is going to be a continued desire to have them grow under the umbrella of U.S. military protection. I think there's also no question the U.S. is going to look to limit its investment, limits its exposure to places just because we have an increasingly constrained environment, and I think the U.S. is going to grow increasingly hostile to ideas of freeloading or free riders in international security. This could reach a crisis point if sanctions with Iran start to crumble, and there's a sense the U.S. is paying the military price, paying the cost, and the rest of the world is importing Iranian oil at U.S. expense. For all that there's criticism, there's a lot of criticism that this is just the Obama administration. Right? That there's something wrong with this president, with his aides, that they don't get it, and the moment of American greatness is going to return as soon as we get the real president, is what the argument is. I think that's wishful thinking. I think we're into a retrenchment of the U.S. understanding of its role, the U.S. commitment, the U.S. willingness, the U.S. definition of what threats are and what kind of force it takes to deal with the threats, the U.S. insistence that other people have to contribute to dealing with the threats around the world. I think we're at an inflection point. This U.S. posture in the Middle East was based on a bipolar world, in which the U.S. commitment to the Western Alliance dependence on Middle Eastern oil, explained a lot of why the U.S. was involved in the region the way it was, shifting global energy patterns and changing nature of global threats. I think represents a much deeper shift in the regional order than most people want to admit. Ultimately, this whole thing comes down to a question of what the U.S. wants its global role to be. And I think the Middle East, and the way the U.S. treats the Middle East connection to Asia, ends up being the best prism through which to see the way the U.S. sees the global world. You can see this area between the Strait of Hormuz and the Straits of Malacca as the other side of the world from the United States. There's no natural reason the U.S. must be there. It's not a contingent ocean. It doesn't border the United States. You could argue the threats aren't threats that threaten the United States. But the willingness to be exposed here, which I think comes out of a willingness to lead an international coalition of states to protect these international seaways, that's about what U.S. willingness is. It's about the U.S. willingness to lead an international effort to do that. It's about people's willingness to follow U.S. leadership in doing that. And I think what ends up being is the U.S. as a global power will depend on the willingness to invest in this side of the world, the willingness to stay here, the ability to persuade others to invest in a U.S.-led effort at common prosperity and security. Thank you.